It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Raymond Raad, who has been a lecturer for us for a number of years, has been coming to our graduate seminar. Ray is a psychiatrist in New York City. He got a degree in mathematics from MIT and then his MD from Columbia. And will be talking today about knowing yourself. Very important topic. And we'll see what I know he will be able to add his wisdom and experience as a therapist to the general principles we may know. So, Ray, welcome, and I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks. Can everyone hear me? The mic is working. Okay, obviously. Thanks. So, yeah, as David said, thanks, David, I'm going to be talking about not the entire subject of developing self-awareness, because it's a very big subject, but I've learned a lot about it from being a therapist in some way that I think fits pretty well with Objectivism, and I want to add a little bit to our knowledge about that. By way of introduction, what it is that I'm talking about, we all know what it means to develop self-awareness. It's a part of our daily life, so I'm not sort of introducing it for the first time to anybody. But to be sort of explicit about it, it's generally a process of conceptualization and integration of our inner states and our behaviors and sort of making sense of ourselves, which we're all doing all the time as part of life, some more than others perhaps. But I wanted to say that it's very specifically the discovery of causal relationships among ourselves. It's not just learning about each individual aspect, but it's developing a sense in how they fit together. And it's part of developing our life narrative. I think understanding ourselves is a process of developing a sense of who we are over time that fits into some sort of story about who we are. We're all sort of doing this all the time, and we're developing a more and more elaborate and integrated story. It's obviously very important. We all sort of know the answer to why it's important. But in essence, I think a lot of it is especially important in the modern world, because the modern world requires a lot of the self. We no longer live in a traditional society where you know from birth what your career you should go into, who you're going to marry, whatever. We have to make our own choices, and we have to live with a lot of personal responsibility. And so we have to sort of decide which of the aspects that life offers us fit us. It also helps us with a number of other things, like developing closer personal relationships and uncovering problems and understanding them better. Self-awareness has a little bit of a history in Objectivism, quite a history in Objectivism. Ayn Rand made it clear in a number of her writings, in a number of different places, that the processing of our internal states and the processing of our behaviors is very important. Here's just sort of one quote from her and another one by Nathaniel Branden, but the claim is made elsewhere too. But also, if you look into her fiction, she makes it important in her fiction, but she also gives us a sense of what she means by it. So if we look at The Fountainhead, where I think sometimes she gets into this a little bit deeper than other places, if we look at Howard Roark and Peter Keating, she gives us an implicit sense of what she means by somebody who's integrated and who's self-aware. Howard Roark is more or less that person, and that's he's somebody who knows what he's doing at all times, more or less. He knows, he acts in sort of an integrated manner. He takes the time to sort of understand what's going on within himself, and he rarely feels emotions that he doesn't understand or that he doesn't seek to understand. And Peter Keating is the opposite in a lot of these. But in terms of how she helps us get to that state, she says very little about that. But one place where she does, well, maybe not very little, but little, and one place where she does is in Atlas Shrugged, where she talks a lot about when you notice problems in your life, if we were to extend this particular quote, then look inside and figure out what doesn't fit, what contradictions are you embracing. But this particular element of knowing yourself, it's very important, but it emphasizes knowing your explicit beliefs, your explicit thoughts. And that's sort of where it all starts. You need to know your values, you need to know what you believe, you need to make sure that each thing that you believe is based in evidence, that you're open to alternative evidence, and we all know all of that. But that is certainly where it starts. But I'm going to add, I'm going to talk about a few principles of going a little bit further in certain cases, or certainly applying it in a certain way. And I'm going to talk about 3 principles that I think are very helpful in understanding any particular aspect of ourselves. The first is generally a principle of objectivism, committing to reason, which is a very broad principle, but what does it mean when we're examining aspects of ourselves? I'm going to talk about examining your emotions very specifically. I'm going to talk about sometimes holding back moral judgment that may get in the way of examining yourself as a person. So committing to reason. What does that mean in terms of understanding yourself? It means a few different things, sort of breaking it down. It certainly means seeking things about yourself to understand further. Now, when you say, to a certain extent, that may be your answer, when you say, what about yourself don't you already understand, something may already come up for you. There's something that, a behavior that doesn't fully make sense, some ways in which you act contradictory, I don't know what the right word is there, but, or feelings that you don't understand in your life that you face, or beliefs that you hold on to and don't quite refuse to give up, but you don't know why. But there's also a way of, it's also helpful to look at your life in a very directed manner, to see if there are things about yourself that you don't fully understand or that are not fully integrated into your story of yourself. And it requires looking at it in a very particular way, rather than looking at it as a way of sort of criticizing yourself, looking at it as a way of looking at it as an opportunity to understand yourself better. And then it means looking for causal connections among aspects, and then integrating it into a story. So the examining and looking for things you don't understand is a matter of just sort of being on a constant lookout of how you behave, constant effort of observing your own behaviors, observing your own thoughts, observing your own feelings, and looking for things that aren't already things that fully make sense to you. Often that means things that aren't going well, but that doesn't have to be the case. But that's sort of where the questions that are in the handout come from. There's sort of it's looking at your life in a very particular way that I think is helpful. It's basically being clear about your moral standard, holding yourself up to it in each aspect of your life, and then seeing how you're really doing, sort of a general self-assessment. So, in these particular list of questions, I sort of break it down into different broad aspects of life that are important within the objectivist view of ethics. Your performance in work, your performance in relationships, and then really holding yourself up to a high standard, but in each aspect of each thing that you're doing. And sort of leaving no stone unturned in that regard. Okay? But to go further, so then you sort of find something, you're sort of looking at it one by one, you find something that you don't fully understand about yourself. Let's take an example of John, and we'll sort of work through this particular example together. This is examples that I'm going to talk about are examples that I know from my life and my work, but they're also they're not false. They're real examples, but they're also not, for the sake of confidentiality, they're not examples of any particular person. They're sort of integrations of people. So John is a 32-year-old corporate lawyer. He thinks he's good at his job and has received positive feedback from his boss and is generally doing well. But he's noticed that he's having trouble focusing on work recently and is sometimes nervous. His job requires frequent meetings with clients and other lawyers. Prior to meetings, he gets restless, finds himself sweating on his palms, and wishing he could avoid the meetings and stay in his office. He pushes himself to go to the meetings anyway, but struggles through them. He's ashamed of these patterns because he, quote, should be better than this. He has big ambitions, so he pushes himself to focus, but it only works to an extent. So here we see someone who's more or less is ambitious, is self-driven, but somehow isn't sort of meeting one particular aspect of what that means in a particular context. And so a real temptation here is to say, that's a problem, I don't have this problem, I'm just going to sort of focus, I'm just going to do it. But alternatively, you can see it as, you can look at it from another angle of why is this going on? Okay, the trying to push through it is not always the answer. For John, that would mean, or for anybody, that would mean, okay, how long has this been going on? Asking questions to try to get at causal answers. How long is this going on? In what context do I do this? But also, how has this particular behavior ever been manifested in any other place? And how is it that what I do here kind of looks like what I've done elsewhere? And the key here is to look for patterns. When we try to understand any particular behavior as an isolated scenario, it's much harder to make sense of it. If we start to notice that something we've done one place kind of might relate to something we've done elsewhere, we have a pattern about ourselves that then we can look for causal reasons for. So John does this. When John stops to think about it, he notices he does not have trouble paying attention to other things, like reading books. He recalls that his problem began 2 months ago, roughly around the time of his annual review. He was expecting to get a glowing review and a raise, but was disappointed that he didn't. But he thought he'd gotten over that by now. And John also recalls that back in college, he had trouble paying attention in the class after he'd received an unfair grade on the midterm. So here we're seeing the beginnings of potentially it doesn't extend everywhere in his life, it extends in some context. It's potentially related to something that happened in a previous time. Okay? And the beginnings of a pattern. He begins to wonder why he did not request the raise that he thought he deserved. Then he notices that he's never been the type to confront people like his boss. He always believed that if he worked hard, people would automatically recognize that. As he thinks about it further, he notices he also sometimes has trouble asserting his needs with his wife and friends. But that had never raised his curiosity before. So now we have a potential pattern. So then when you start to notice patterns about yourself, the next thing to look for is causal, why is this happening? To search within yourself for why. And broadly, causes of behavior and patterns are biological or psychological. The bulk of self-understanding, as Ayn Rand stressed, is psychological. But there's always biological factors that impact upon everything we do, and it's helpful to be mindful of them. One thing that Walter's going to talk about later this today is temperament. There are other biological factors. These are just some I've listed up there. Drives and urges, intelligence and natural abilities. There can be others. In the case of John's problem, you can imagine at the level of biology, he has some temperaments that makes it harder for him to be assertive, perhaps. But you want to keep biology in mind. But the bulk is looking at our thoughts and emotions, which is broadly what psychology breaks down into. And when we're looking at thoughts, well, we'll deal with emotions a little bit later. When we're dealing with thoughts, I like to think of dividing the cognitive causes of any particular behavior or action, sort of divided into individual, at the level of individual thoughts, or at the level of structured thoughts. Individual thoughts are just sort of a thought you have about a particular thing that comes up and relates to something you do, or relates to something you believe about something. But even these occur at different levels of awareness and sort of different types. It's certainly true that a lot of our thoughts are things that we're thinking consciously and very deliberately. If someone asks you what color is the sky is blue, sort of think that. We also look at thoughts that come up at an automatic level. You're in a particular situation, a thought that's not necessarily a part of your view of the world comes up to you at a moment. You're on your way to an interview and you think, oh, what if I screw up? I'm going to screw up. You know you're well prepared. The thought just happens. There's also thoughts, unconscious thoughts, that are entirely outside our awareness. Sometimes they're preconceptual or repressed, but can impact our behaviors. But Looking at individual thoughts is a little bit hard. Thoughts don't just sort of occur as individual items in our mind over time. They get grouped as beliefs in sort of different levels of structure. These can be divided sort of just on the level of complexity between beliefs and something higher level. Beliefs are a few thoughts that come together that form an integrated view of a particular item. So someone may have the belief that increasing the minimum wage will raise effective wages, bring more people out of poverty, and help make the world a better place. Okay, I don't believe that, but that's not just one thought you have about something. That's a few different that come together, and they work together in tandem every time you think about the minimum wage. When you get even more complicated, psychologists have sort of varied in their terms used for this, but we think in terms of stories, narratives, or fantasies. These are much more complicated series of thoughts that often work with imagery in our mind. You may not be entirely aware of various stories and fantasies that we're walking around with, but they impact our behaviors and beliefs about any particular thing. Okay, so Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist who studied the political belief, among other things, political beliefs and people's tendencies to have certain political beliefs. And in an article for Reason magazine a couple of years ago, he wrote about liberals, conservatives, and libertarians, that said that their views on politics are not just sort of a result of any particular one thought that they have about what's the best world or particular disagreements. They result from stories that they have about the world of politics that they carry around with them. Some people, the smartest ones and the ones who are most self-aware, may know what those stories are. But liberals have a story, conservatives have a story, and libertarians have a story. And this is the liberal story. Once upon a time, the vast majority of human persons suffered in societies and social institutions that were unjust, unhealthy, repressive, and oppressive. These traditional societies were reprehensible because of their deep-rooted inequality, exploitation, and irrational traditionalism. But the noble human aspiration for autonomy, equality, and prosperity struggled mightily against the forces of misery and oppression, and eventually succeeded in establishing modern, liberal, democratic, capitalist welfare societies. There is much work to be done to dismantle the powerful vestiges of inequality, exploitation, and repression. This struggle for the good society in which individuals are equal and free to pursue their self-defined happiness is the one mission truly worth dedicating one's life to achieving. So he says that this is more or less what a lot of liberals walk around with as their story of politics and their story of the struggle of politics over time. So here we're imagining this is not just one thought, right? You have a views of history. You have imagery of the great society that you imagine that you're working towards. You have a number of different things. And this shapes your particular view about any particular political question or in any particular political debate or discussion. This is not foreign to any of us. Ayn Rand wrote stories for a reason. She knew this quite well. But I want to make this... but I want to just emphasize that understanding ourselves is a matter of understanding our stories about particular things that we have in our world. And here this is an example of a political story, but we hold stories about all kinds of things. And the key to understand this, to go back for a second, is Jonathan Haidt makes the claim, but it's also clear, not every liberal who holds the story knows that they hold the story in its entirety. They have it somewhere in their mind. It is working within them in their view of any particular matter. And in the same way, we have stories. These are just some important stories that we have. We all have stories about who we are as people, lots of stories about who we are individually. We have stories about each particular other person who's important in our lives, maybe even people who are not so important. We have stories about our relationships with any particular others. We have stories about our relationships with different aspects of the world. So in understanding the causes of any particular pattern of behavior, I think the key is to understand our thoughts but understanding our thoughts as they relate to particular stories that we hold. So there's sort of a search for individual stories that has to be involved. So John takes this approach, just to wrap up the case of John to make sense of this, as he thinks about what stories might be related to the particular problem and symptom that he's having. He realizes he's always imagined himself to be a great lawyer and a great husband. Superficially, he always believed that he should not need to assert his needs and wishes because other people should recognize his virtues on their own. But then as he thought about this further, he also noticed that he worries that if he were to assert his wishes and, quote, rock the boat, people would not like him as much. They might feel burdened by him, not want him around. And as he thinks about this through and imagines asking his boss for a raise, his palms begin to sweat and he has trouble focusing on his work. Okay, and John begins to wonder if previous troubles with attention and nervousness in his life also related to stories about asserting himself. So this is just an example. This is the beginning of John's self-understanding. There's more stories, more to be uncovered and understood. But just sort of to wrap up this particular aspect of the talk, I think understanding ourselves requires seeking things very particularly that aren't integrated into our current narrative of our lives, and looking very deliberately at connections about how we do one thing and another, development of understanding of patterns, and then searching for causes of those patterns in biology, and then in thoughts, and very particularly in our stories. And then in sort of this cycle of further developing the story of our lives in a more nuanced and integrated way that makes sense of more things that we do. The next principle, exploring your emotions. Emotions have a sort of a complex history in objectivism. On the one hand, Ayn Rand made it absolutely clear that they're not tools of cognition. But she also made it clear, I think, when she's read appropriately, that they're very important to understand and to make sense of, and to integrate. But then when we get into the novels and the way that she portrays that particular process, often her protagonists rarely speak about their emotions very deliberately, whereas the antagonists are often driven by the emotions, and emotions come up very frequently in the novels. I think sometimes you can get the false impression from that emotions have to be in some sense relegated or suppressed in some way. I think it's a false understanding, but it's still a common understanding. There's been a lot more work done on emotions since Ayn Rand. Nathaniel Branden elaborated on the role of emotions in a number of different ways sort of that I listed up there. And Marcia Enright wrote a great article in the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies reviewing some literature on emotions and their usefulness. But I want to talk about emotions in a slightly different way. Emotions as a tool of understanding ourselves better, which I think neither of them really gets into, to my satisfaction at least. And if we take the objectivist and actually the general scientific view of emotions, which more or less correlate, it's basically this, just sort of as a diagram. You face a situation, that particular situation sort of impacts you and somehow mixes with whatever a bunch of thoughts you have, biological predispositions, and you get an emotion as an output of this combination. This process, we can use emotions as a guide, if we reverse this process, as a tool toward understanding what we actually think about a particular situation. And they can be used in two different ways at least. Emotions are often a guide. They can be a guide to thoughts that we have that we're not aware that we have, and aspects and even stories that we're holding in our minds that we're not entirely aware we have. A common example is if you're having an emotion in a situation that somehow doesn't fit your beliefs about it, or doesn't fit the full extent of what you think you believe about it, it's still usually a hint that there's something you do believe that you haven't sort of toyed with. Emotions can also be a mechanism of relating current experiences to past experiences and multiple current experiences together. Memories are stored in our mind in such a way that that memories tend to come up in a particular pattern, such that if you're experiencing an emotion at a time, usually memories in which you had that relate to that particular emotion are more likely to come out. So there's a sense in which your thoughts and your connections may be related more to an emotion than to their logical connection. And understanding your emotion helps understand those particular connections. The first step, though, is to be aware of your emotions. I'm going to do a little exercise. If people have a paper and pen, or if not, use your notepad on your phone or something like that, or think about it if you don't have either of those. Here's a question that's posed. You and your friend are in the same line of work. There's a prize given annually to the best performance of the year. The two of you work hard to win the prize. One night the winner's announced, and it's your friend. How would you feel, and how would your friend feel? Let's take 15 seconds or something, or 20 seconds. Just try to give your answer to those. All right, so this was asked, actually, this question comes from a study of a scale that was developed called the Levels of Emotional Awareness, which tests the level of conceptual clarity of emotional experience. And they noticed that people answered at they sort of divided people's answers in 5 different levels, from least conceptually clear and explicit to most. The first level, and this is sort of from level 1 to 5, okay? The first is answering in terms of physiologic feelings. I feel tired, I would feel sick, okay? That's a feeling, but it's in the body. It's not so much a mental experience. Okay? You may have a mental response to it of some sort. Okay? The next level is answering in terms of valence of the emotion. I would feel good, or I would feel bad, or I would feel like punching the wall, which gives a valence, but also doesn't name any particular emotion. Okay? Level 3 gets at conceptualizing a single emotion that you would experience. I would feel sad, let this happen, something like that. Level 4 and 5 get to cognitive relationships among the emotions. I would feel 2 or more emotions in their relationship. I would feel sad that I lost, but happy for my friend at the same time. Okay? Now, we may all recognize that once it's stated, but the question is to be able to sort of say that and their particular relationship to yourself at the moment. And then the level 5 is multiple emotions for the self and the friend and their relationship. I would feel sad, disappointed in myself, envious of my friend, guilty that I feel envious of my friend. And my friend would feel perhaps happy about it, a little sad for me, and maybe a little guilty if he thought I had done a better job than he did, or I thought I was equally worthy. Okay, so this is important to get at, because this is the more complex you can get in this regard, the more complexity which you can really assess your own thoughts to a particular matter. Because each emotion is tied to thoughts and a story in some way. And the more that you can name several of them, the more that you can understand. So in some sense, when you're examining your life, and as you're looking at any of the questions that are on that list or any particular situation, you should make it a habit to really stop and explicitly think about the emotions that you're facing in any particular situation, because that's your guide from that point forward. It's your guide to fully understanding what you're thinking. Okay? And the guide should be in this sort of way. Whenever you're understanding a situation, it's what emotions am I feeling, and then why am I feeling it? Okay? You don't want to leave the emotion just standing there. It's not enough to just to understand what it is. And so we're right back to causality. So in terms of why am I feeling it, search for stories, thoughts. Again, each particular emotion has stories associated with it. And you want to search for other moments or contexts in which you felt that particular feeling. But as you do this over time, and as you develop a habit of doing this, you also want to look at your ranges of emotions over time in different contexts. And so you want to ask yourself whether you're really able to experience the full range of emotions, positive and negative in a variety of contexts, or whether you feel in any way inhibited in the experience of one or more of your emotions at over time. It's very common for people to feel inhibited in the experience of certain negative emotions. Negative emotions are naturally uncomfortable. By negative, I don't mean morally negative, I mean uncomfortable, that the experience of the emotion itself is uncomfortable. Anger, fear, sadness, envy are uncomfortable to feel. And so there's a tendency, whether we're aware of it or not, at least in subtle things, to try to ignore those particular emotions, to pretend they don't exist, to sort of look the other way. That you want to be aware of whether you're really feeling them. But some people also, I think particularly people who sort of approach life in a somewhat self-sacrificial way or sort of influenced by self-sacrificial ideas, can also avoid positive emotions. So you want to be aware of that. I also think there's sort of a belief out there, sort of taken aside, that makes it that also inhibits people's experience of their emotions. Not sure how prevalent it is. Sometimes it seeps into objectivism, but it's a belief in our culture that somehow happiness is an experience of positive emotion. It may seem, or that it's positive thinking. Now, happiness involves positive emotion. It does involve positive thinking at the appropriate time and place. But happiness as such, I don't think can be equated with that. And happiness has to involve the full experience, full in magnitude of the full range of emotions, each at their particular time and place with the appropriate accompanying thoughts. I'll read through this example kind of quickly because I want to get to one last point. I just want to give you an example of how an emotion can be used in this case to try to understand a particular problem better. Emily and Sarah are dating, and Sarah got a big promotion and came home and excitedly told Emily about it. As Emily listened, she felt a glimmer of excitement and congratulated Sarah, but then she began to feel uneasy in some way. This troubled Emily because she wanted to be supportive. This meant a lot to Sarah, and Emily recognized that. So Emily blamed herself for being selfish and unsupportive, but despite that, could not get herself to feel the excitement or happiness that she was trying to feel for Sarah. So what happened? Initially, she felt excited, but then uneasy. So uneasy is not an emotion. It's a valence. So the first step is, what's the emotion that you're feeling? So you have to sit there and just feel it and try to name it. And so Emily does this. She focuses on her state, and she realizes she's feeling angry. And that made her ashamed. She doesn't want to be angry over this kind of situation. But also angry at whom, angry why. And the temptation here is to just say, I don't want to be angry. This person's got a promotion. I support them. Okay, and to shut down the anger. But that doesn't aid in self-understanding. The answer is to look at it and try to understand why. So Emily sits with the emotion of anger, and she reflects on the stories as they relate to it. She began to think that Sarah is going to be working more hours and is not going to be available. Sarah has already been busy with work and has not been helping out around the house as much. Now she'll be even less involved. And what about their plans to take up hiking on weekends? Will that have to be sacrificed? Emily remembered feeling a similar emotion commonly in her prior relationship with Katie. Katie was often emotionally unavailable, which Emily found frustrating. And Emily realized that some of her anger was left over from that prior relationship. Okay, so starting to sort of understand where that emotion is coming from, but only after accepting it. So now she has something, now she can make a decision and decide how to appropriately use the emotion. Okay, so after Emily learned about her own anger, she realized she was justified in wanting Sarah to share in the household and in wanting her attention. She was open to Sarah about these concerns, and they were able to have a more meaningful conversation about their needs and responsibilities. They slowly worked out a plan to make sure they would split their housework and have enough time together to go hiking. Okay, and this helped reduce Emily's anger, and she began to feel more genuine excitement about Sarah's promotion. In the process of somewhere in the process of self-understanding, you may have already noticed this, as we sort of went through this, is people often come across some barrier which they have trouble going further. Okay, there's something difficult about looking at your life and specifically looking for things that aren't working well or that you don't understand, or looking at emotions that are felt negatively or that might mean something. And that's this very commonly, this is what one psychologist, Farrell Silverberg, calls the dignity shield. And it's this worry of what if I find something about myself that I don't like? It's a natural tendency. And I think it stems from a number of different things, but sometimes there are aspects of objectivism that I think sometimes could make it even harder. And that's because I think part of the reason for this is because morality can be expressed and experienced in two different ways, emotionally. On the one hand, morality can be a very uplifting thing. It's seeking your values, seeking to be a better person, and it sort of doesn't get more uplifting than in Rand sometimes. And here's an uplifting quote from Rand. "I started my life with a single absolute, that the world was mine to shape in the image of my highest values and never to be given up to a lesser standard, no matter how long or hard the struggle." But the flip side is, what if you're immoral in some way? And what if you don't meet the moral standard, your own moral standard? And that can be a very emotionally negative and difficult experience. And once again, in Rand, that takes a strong, that can be very extreme too. Here's another quote from Rand. "It is not any crime you've ever committed that infects your soul with permanent guilt, but the knowledge and the fact of your basic default, of suspending your mind, of refusing to think. Fear and guilt are your chronic emotions. They are real and you do deserve them." This is just one example. But it sort of illustrates, I think, two different ways in which people really do experience their morality. People experience falling short of their ethics very negatively. It's a very difficult thing to come to terms with. And that makes it very hard to explore yourself in ways that might uncover something you don't like. But that gets in the way of self-understanding. And it creates the temptation, as you saw in a couple of the examples, to try to ignore something that doesn't make sense to you and to try to think positive or to try to emphasize the things about yourself that do make sense. I'm not, as I thought about it, it's not quite clear what to do about that fact other than to just know that it can be a problem and to be aware of it. But I think sometimes it means holding back negative moral judgments about yourself. And knowing that the act of learning about yourself is virtuous, even if what you learn is not. And just sort of holding that back. There's always more to learn about yourself, and keeping a barrier on understanding any particular part only gets in the way. So that's what I had. This is just my conclusion. I can emphasize searching for connections, patterns, and causes at all times. And in trying to integrate everything you understand into your full context and the full knowledge you have about yourself. So I'll leave it at that.